Hello and welcome to revision tips for SIPS Level 6, Professional Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 7, Commercial Data Management, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to understand the impact of cybersecurity on procurement and supply. So data, much of it big data, is used by organisations in every industry, in every part of the world. Data is a relatively recent commodity and it's highly valuable. With that value comes the threat that an organisation's data will be damaged or stolen by a third party who seeks leverage or power, competitive advantage, or just to cause the organisation some harm. So keeping data safe is a growing industry. Data should only be used for the purpose that it was collected and stored for. So keeping data safe and secure is an important aspect of how all organisations manage risk. Data security has three elements known as the CIA, Information Security Triangle. C for confidentiality, ensuring that only authorised people can access certain data. I for integrity, ensuring that data is not changed or stolen. And A for availability, ensuring that people can gain access to the data when they need it, and that unauthorised people are unable to gain access. Now, data confidentiality and privacy are regulated in many countries by law, and there are risks to an organisation of breaches in confidentiality and privacy, and that can result in damage to business objectives as well as their reputation. Suppliers also hold and use data that is important to a business. And procurement professionals need to ensure that suppliers preserve information security too. Now, although cybersecurity might seem to be something that a person with no knowledge of IT system couldn't hope to understand, in reality, it's a very straightforward concept. Cybersecurity is similar to physical security. So if you have a fence around your factory or a locked gate or a reception desk to restrict access to a building, this is a security system. And when security is breached or an attempt is made to steal or change or disrupt your IT system, this is a cyber attack. So cyber attacks are carried out by hackers, someone who gains unauthorized access to a computer system or a network. But let's look at some of the types of cyber attacks. We've got malware. This is a general term for software that infects a computer or program with a virus. Many types of cyber attacks use malware. Denial of service. This can happen when an IT system receives a large volume of requests or has to undertake a huge amount of transactions at the same time. This leads to it becoming overwhelmed and unable to function properly. So if the attack is carried out by a network of computers known as a botnet, it is known as a distribution denial or a double DOS attack. We've also got man-in-the-middle attack. A man-in-the-middle attack happens when a hacker finds a way of putting their computer in between the client and the server. And being in the middle of that relationship means the hacker can intercept any communication and data sent between the client and the server. You've also got phishing, and this type of cyber attack is with individuals, and it's kind of the one that we're probably most familiar with, to be honest. You know, these cyber attacks are made against organisations as well as individuals. And phishing is when emails appear to be from a trusted source. And it either includes a way of securing information or data from the recipient or an attachment that contains a malware computer virus. You've got the drive-by cyber attack, which is when a hacker targets an insecure website and installs a script that means visitors to the site are given a computer virus. This cyber attack doesn't require the website visitor to act. For example, to click on a link or go to another web page. Once the visitor calls up the website, the drive-by attack is launched. Passwords, many people are familiar with this type of cyber attack as passwords have been used for IT systems for many, many years. So a hacker can obtain a password to enter a computer system in many ways, including using a computer program that attempts to guess it. SQL injection is when a user logs onto an IT system. This type of cyber attack can take place when programming language is inserted into a database as part of the login process. So the SQL injection inserts commands into the IT system that are not part of the program. It can damage the integrity of data within the database or even delete it. We've got cross-site scripting. This is the sort of attack that obtains information from cookies or a user's keystrokes or remote controls of victims' PCs. Eavesdropping is a hacker can intercept network traffic to obtain passwords or even confidential information like a payment card detail. It can be passive when the hacker listens in, or active when the hacker obtains the information by pretending to be a source of the query. And then a birthday one. You've got the form of cyber attack that interferes with authenticity of a digital signature so it can be forged. Now, people who carry out cyber attacks are known as black hat hackers. The motivation for a cyber attack by a black hat hacker can range from personal financial gain to a desire to disrupt an organization or IT system. People who are paid to undertake cyber attacks, sometimes by governments as part of espionage or by organizations involved in terrorism, are described as grey hat hackers. They are paid and their role is being described as being similar to a mercenary soldier. There are many people who hack for good reason, positive reasons, rather than to carry out a cyber attack. These computer programmers are known as white hat hackers. They provide defense against cyber attacks and develop prevention measures. So the white hat hackers try to break into an organization's system so they can detect the weaknesses in its cybersecurity measure and produce a patch. So they will also develop solutions and antidotes to a virus when a cyber attack has occurred. So when an organization acts to guard against a cyber attack, it implements measures that protects its IT systems and data. So these measures will cover secrecy, integrity, and availability. The secrecy, to protect this, an organization makes sure that only authorized people can access confidential information. An attack on secrecy is when a cyber attack makes confidential information available to people outside the business, and they're not authorized to see it. Integrity, when considering cybersecurity relating to integrity, an organization can put measures in place to make sure the data isn't changed. So if a hacker gains access and uses the IT system, this compromises data integrity. And when multinational computer technology company Dell detected a breach in its security in the late 2018, the organization reset the password of all accounts on the Dell.com online store. And this measure aimed to preserve integrity by preventing the theft or compromise of customer data. And then availability. When incidents occur, that means people cannot use or access the system, the website, or the data. This is a cyber attack on availability. Now, cybersecurity, the measure an organization puts in place to protect its data and systems from being stolen, changed, or distributed as part of a cyber attack carried out by those hackers. So the NIST cybersecurity framework has 5 stages. Firstly, you need to identify the cybersecurity risks relating to IT systems, data, people, physical assets, suppliers, or even the supply chain. Protect and implement measures like training or technology that provides cybersecurity. Detect, implement mechanisms that can detect and report anomalies or unusual events. And then respond, define a business continuity plan to be followed in the event of a cyber attack. And finally, recover, have disaster recovery planning processes in place to manage and minimize recovery time. So a large amount of data flows through the supply chain, and the more integrated a supply chain system becomes, the more organizations need to consider the impact that it has across the entire supply chain and how much impact that can have on its own cybersecurity. So to manage supply risks, A business can use questionnaires and implement checks during the sourcing stage to ensure that only suppliers who have an acceptable approach to cybersecurity are used. The checks can be repeated during the lifetime of the contract. And then once potential risks have been identified, management measures can be put in place, like adjusting minimum stock levels to reduce impact of a cyber attack. So now we're going to look at malware. There are different types of malware that you might have heard of before, but we will go through them all as much as we possibly can. Now, malware is basically malicious software. It's a form of cyber attack that installs software without the user's consent, and it can cause significant damage to your IT system and the data it holds. And these are the most common types. A dropper is a program that installs a virus onto a computer. It doesn't contain malicious code, so it's hard for the antivirus software to detect it. But it can access the internet to find out if a virus software is up to date before launching an attack. A file infector is a virus that attaches itself to a file which contains computer programs like a .exe file. When the program file is opened, the virus is activated. A logic bomb, which is malware that attaches itself to an IT application and is triggered by a particular command or logical condition. For example, if the value is equal to 100 or a date and time. A macro virus is a virus that infects a macro in a Microsoft Word or Excel file. It takes effect when the file is opened, and it attaches itself to the code on a computer system. Then we have a polymorphic virus. This type of malware can conceal itself using encryption and decryption. And the virus works by decrypting itself, infecting a piece of code and then encrypting it. Antivirus software can detect this type of virus. And ransomware blocks access to data, sometimes using malware known as cryptoviral extortion. That makes files nearly impossible to recover without a decryption key. The hacker will then threaten the organization with publication of the data unless a ransom is paid. A system infector is also known as a boot record infector. And this type of malware attaches itself to the startup program on a computer's hard drive. When the system starts, it uses the boot program, and the virus is activated as it's loaded into the computer memory. The system infector malware can transfer itself to other computers and drives. And then a Trojan. As the name implies, Trojan malware can hide in another program. A Trojan is not able to replicate itself. Instead, it's used to gain an entry point into the software that can then be used by a hacker to launch an attack. Or a worm. So instead of attaching itself to a program, a worm is a self-contained program that spreads across computers and networks. It's usually spread when an email attachment is opened. And when this occurs, a worm will send a copy of itself to every contact in the infected computer's user address book. And it can also spread across the internet and is the source of many DOS attacks. Now, understanding the types of cyber attacks can really help an organization to plan for and mitigate against any cyber risks in the supply chain. So examples include cyber-terrorism, which is a cyber attack with some political motive. And government organizations that provide goods and services to a government are particularly at risk from this type of attack. And we've talked about malware, a form of cyber attack that installs software without your consent. And then we've got advanced persistent threat, when a hacker gains entry to an organization's IT system or network for an extended period of time. Increased likelihood that the hacker is able to access confidential or personal data. So the stages of the APT process is illegal access to data and changes of data to corrupt an organization's data so it makes it useless, or it can be stolen. The vulnerabilities in software applications and networks are discovered and exploited by malicious hackers, counterfeit computer hardware, and indicators that provide intelligence that the APT Act is underway, including increasing a log of activity outside working hours, the discovery of a Trojan malware, large unexpected flows of data, particularly to unexpected external destinations, expected bundles of data being generated or reports being produced that are not part of the business as usual process, and detected cyber attacks where attempts to hack passwords have taken place. Now, in many countries, it is illegal to access and make changes to data stored on a computer unless you've been granted permission. And it makes it a crime to install malware. But it's not a crime if someone accidentally accesses data because an organisation has not put it in the right place or hasn't had the right security put in place. But crimes that involve illegal access to and theft of data are constantly being reported. And in November 2018, it was reported that almost all major Pakistani banks had been affected by cybercrime, and that data, which included over 19,000 debit card details, had been stolen. Of the highest profile breaches, some of which have been used in case studies here, none have reported data being changed. And this is an extract from the UK government survey, which shows the types of cyber attacks experienced in 2018. Now, when a malicious hacker finds a vulnerability in a software application or a network, they will take steps to exploit it. But not all vulnerabilities, however, result in a cyber attack taking place. And the difference is that vulnerable, a theoretical way that a system or network could be subjected to a cyber attack, and exploitable is an actual way that a system or network could be subjected to a cyber attack. And there are a number of reasons why a vulnerability may not be exploitable. Insufficient relevant information is available for the hacker to use, or it requires access to a system and an organisation has sufficient measures in place to prevent that from happening, or the security controls and measures that an organisation uses to protect software applications are sufficient enough to prevent a cyber attack. So understanding the difference between vulnerable and exploitable is really important, because you really need to focus resources on prevention measures on the exploitable. Now, for an organisation to manage the SCCS risks, it needs to consider coordinated and planned approach to ensuring all risks have been considered and can be mitigated. So an organisation needs to promote a culture of cyber resilience through the supply chain by assessing cybersecurity risks, acting to mitigate against them, and effectively managing suppliers and the supply chain. So examples of measures to reduce the risks is buying only from trusted vendors, using an organisation that achieved a relevant accreditation of quality standard, or asking suppliers to respond to a pre-qualification questionnaire. You could also disconnect critical machines from outside networks to remove risks associated with access to the internet, and that makes systems vulnerable to attack. You could educate users on the threats and protective measures they can take, like keeping passwords secure and understanding what threat exists and how to recognise the risks via email, and control measures when dealing with suppliers. So you've got the physical security of the products during manufacture, storage and distribution. And this is the control measure designed to reduce the likelihood of an installation of malware onto the hardware. The second is restricting communication between supplier and organisations to named individuals. And this could reduce the likelihood of social engineering and phishing by ensuring that the contact is effectively managed. And the third is restricting access to the organisation or the supplier's IT system to users who have enhanced cybersecurity. And that could reduce the likelihood that malware is spread from one organisation to another. So organisations that use data for robotics and automation need to ensure their data is kept as secure as organisations that deal with personal data. If data that drives technology automation is compromised, the impact on the function of the technology may result in physical damage or harm. To create a completely secure system, supply chain cybersecurity needs to focus on physical cybersecurity, the methods used to protect devices and data centers to make sure the servers and networks can't be compromised by physical intervention. So examples here would be alarm systems and CCTV cameras. The security of devices linked to the Internet of Things should also form part of an organization's physical security approach. And the questions to ask in relation to physical security is, how is it used, and is the device secure? How can device health be monitored? Can the device be kept healthy? And the third connected element is people. Threats can arise as a result of lack of training, particularly for employees who work for suppliers at the start of the supply chain, or if employees decide to exploit the privileged position they have to compromise cybersecurity in a deliberate way, or from omitting to terminate accounts of employees when they leave an organisation. Now, these cyber measures rely on people that are most likely to fail and lead to a cyber attack. Employees need to receive training on cybersecurity protocols to minimise the risks associated with people. And then technical cybersecurity will involve predicting and preventing cyber attacks using hardware and software measures. And there are two approaches to this: a component-driven one, which is a bottom-up approach, which is on the right-hand side. And that looks at each part of the organisation's IT systems individually to identify what those risks are. And then a system-driven or top-down approach focuses on the overall goal or purpose of the system. And that can be used to ensure the overall objective is achieved. The UK National Cybersecurity Centre recognises and recommends using both approaches. Now, a system-driven approach to the assessment of cyber risks focuses on the overall goal of a purpose of a system rather than the component parts. So to assess the risk of a cyber attack using this approach, a business would identify the purpose of the system. So an example of a system purpose is to provide data on stock held in the factory that enables inventory to be maintained at an agreed level. So keeping the overall purpose in mind, the system as a whole can be assessed, including how each part interacts with each other. Unlike a risk identified through a component-driven assessment, a system-driven risk arises when parts of the system interact. And a system-driven approach prevents unintended consequences by considering each component separately and can be used to ensure overall objectives are achieved. Now, to implement a system-driven approach, the business needs to identify its cybersecurity risk appetite. And being clear about how acceptable an impact or loss to an organisation helps to determine what control measures are required. And the risks an organisation needs to consider would be the risk to public health or loss of life. So it could be where you've got an IT system at a nuclear power station. Clearly, that would be an extremely low appetite for risk. The second would be the exposure to large-scale fraud or theft. For example, when a cyber attack would compromise personal or financial data, again, organisations may have an extremely low risk for appetite. The breach to regulations or breaking the law. So, for example, a social media company in the US where fines have historically been low. In the EU, under GDPR, the risk appetite in relation to cybersecurity may be lower because financial penalties are more severe. And finally, the disruption to business processes. And when an organisation is heavily reliant on data, its appetite for risk will be lower than when the data plays a more peripheral role. Now, an organisation can use software to provide protection against cyber attacks in a number of ways. put controls in place to prevent access to systems, and use various methods to reduce data corruption should the access controls be breached, and use software to put external controls in place to prevent access to networks and systems, and implement internal software controls to prevent data corruption should a hacker gain access. So you can see this here. On the left, you've got the preventing access, and on the right, you've got the preventing corruption. So in terms of preventing access, an organisation can use a firewall to restrict access to its network. Firewalls have been used as a cybersecurity measure for many years, and businesses can also use a firewall to monitor incoming and outgoing network traffic. And there's loads of rules you can put in place to block specific traffic. For example, access by users inside a network to a particular external website. And you can do this using proxy, the type of firewall that an IT system puts in place, rather than on the whole network. So it could be just on the procure to pay system rather than the whole network. You can do the stateful inspection, which is quite traditional. An early type of firewall that works as a connection level where access to and from network, known as network intrusion, takes place. And a unified threat management, a UTM, a firewall that includes security measures such as anti-spam, email filtering, along with connection level measures. And as firewalls have been available for many years, it's most likely that the medium to large businesses will have them. When considering your supply chain security risk appetite of a supplier, the use of firewall software can be useful as an indicator. So have a question that you ask your suppliers about their firewalls in the sourcing process. And that's something that a procurement team could consider. Now, one of the most effective ways to provide data security is to regulate which users can access the network and the IT system. And that's carried out using authentication. Software is available to carry out the task, and there are 3 common factors that enable a person to provide authentication. Something you know, like a password, a question, or a personal identification number. Something you have, like a one-time passkey or a token, or something that you are. So for example, your fingerprint or another biometric characteristic. So there are lots of ways in which a number of combinations of characters, numbers, and letters increase the more digits are used in a password. So if you've got like a 4-digit password length, there's about 10,000 possible combinations. A 6-digit password goes up to about 1 million, but an 8-digit one has 458 trillion possible combinations. And more and more, we're using biometrics as a unique identifier about a person to provide a security check. And we have some that are kind of physiological and behavioural, but the most common types of biometrics are things like finger vein, voice recognition, DNA, your iris recognition, fingerprint, hand, or even facial recognition. And the use of biometric security, a device needs to have the capability or modularity to log the biometric, so to capture your fingerprint or listen to your speech. Now, although most data security activity focuses on software to prevent or detect a cyber attack, there are ways that computer hardware can be used as part of the data security process. Hardware solutions can prevent read and write access to data and offer very strong protection against tampering and unauthorized access. So when hardware is used to provide cybersecurity measures, it's known as hardware root of trust, which is basically part of the hardware that cannot be affected by the cyber attack. Cyber attacks on hardware can also be made when malicious circuits are added to the microchips used in computers and devices. But microchip manufacturing is carried out in many parts of the world, so it's become quite difficult for organizations to make checks to ensure security during the design and manufacture process. And when malicious hardware is in place, it can remain dormant for many years before it's used to launch a cyber attack. Organisations prevent read-write access to its critical parts of IT systems by ensuring that it's encrypted its hard drive. Measures known as read blockers can also be used to provide protection against tampering and unauthorised access. So a read blocker works by encrypting the whole hard drive to protect the data and programs on, in case it's stolen or lost, and sometimes this encryption is included in the hardware. This is known as a self-encrypting device. But data is often stored on an external storage device as a way of transferring it from one network to another. So it's important that data integrity on these external devices is protected, as while in transit, the risk of loss or theft is much greater. So many businesses need to demonstrate that they have no chance of deletions while the data is in transit. If it is to be used as an evidence for legal or regulatory processes. And portable devices like mobile phones, tablets, and laptops are ways that an organisation's data can be accessed from any location at any time. The connectivity that these devices have to the networks and other devices and the internet do increase risks because data could be lost, confidentiality or privacy rules relating to data could be breached, and the device could be used to access the network to carry out that cyber attack. And many organisations use Wi-Fi to connect to their corporate network and the internet, particularly small and medium-sized businesses. But when an organisation is considering cybersecurity and the hardware it uses, the equipment used to support a Wi-Fi network is included. And what you need to think about for cybersecurity of Wi-Fi is that it can also be extended to the equipment used by suppliers. And an unsecure network means an organisation is vulnerable to a cyber attack, and tampering with data and unknown access can occur. So Wi-Fi connectivity is made possible using hardware known as a router. And a number of actions can be taken to improve your router security, such as sort of locating it in a secure place and changing the login settings from the default, changing the name, checking for firmware updates, and checking if the router has a firewall, and also setting up your public and private access. And organisations are using devices known as the Internet of Things, like tracking devices on goods in transit that provide data to support the supply chain management process. But as the Internet of Things devices are connected to the internet, the potential for cyber attacks exist. So a hardware firewall can be used to protect any IoT device that an organisation uses. And that hardware firewall can be set up to protect the IoT devices in particular locations like a factory. But there are a number of steps an organisation can take to check the security of IoT devices, and a number of guides have been produced. So the infographic on the screen is a really good example. Now, a backup is a copy of an organisation's data that can be used should an IT system fail or if a cyber attack occurs. In order to minimise disruption, the backup policy can include details of how sensitive and personal data will be treated. Sensitive data could be backed up using an encrypted process. Backup copies should be stored in a different location, both online and offline, and they should be tested to ensure that they can be accessed and used if required. But backups can do a number of things. They can be continuous. A copy of data is made every time data is added, changed, or deleted, or happens at a set date and time. But backup good practice will include ensuring that any device used for backup procedures is not exposed to the same cybersecurity of those on which the main version of data is held. It can create more than one copy of that data as part of the process and store copies in different places, both virtually and geographically, to reduce the risk of a backup failure. But do check your supplier's backup policies, particularly when it's a third-party data storage. and put system administration policies in place to ensure that the organisation and its suppliers have suitable backup procedures to identify the security risks and then take action to reduce them. And suppliers may need data in order to help build, develop and test an IT system. Data masking is a technique used to give suppliers access to data they need, while changing or obscuring data to ensure that confidentiality and security is preserved. So some techniques of data masking include character scrambling. So characters in a field in a database are scrambled so that the original content is not revealed. So for example, the entry of the last name field, Mackenzie, is scrambled to say something completely different. Deletion. Data is deleted out, so it's not shown to users who do not have access, also known as nulling out. Or encryption. Data is encrypted and users need a key to access it. It's the most secure form of data masking. And number and date variances change specific data into a wide range to preserve the specifics, like changing an employee's salary of $40,000 to a range of 35 to 45, or changing a date from the 5th of May 2020 just to May 20. Shuffling data in a column in a random way makes it so that it's no longer held in the data included in the original document. And substitution is a process that basically mimics the real data, but doesn't provide for it. So for example, changing the last name of all records to Smith. So to develop a data masking policy, your business should also identify the data that needs to be masked, determine what masking is required, implement an appropriate masking approach. And organizations are now starting to use data masking to improve security and reduce the threat of a data or privacy breach. And the supply market of providers of data masking services is growing, and it's likely that procurement of these services will increase in the coming years. So I guess, making sure that your data retention and erasure policy is in place is an important element of strict and secure system administration. And that plays an important role in your data security. If an organization needs to share data across different functions or third parties, then data masking is a useful tool that can be used to protect the privacy. And making sure that it's permanently erased is part of the final process. And that can be achieved using the correct software, but also ensuring that suppliers comply with the relevant terms. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 3. Thank you very much for watching.